You know, bass anglers have literally hundreds of baits to choose from. A successful day out in the water often hinges on picking the right bait for the right situation. Unfortunately, it's easy for an angler to make the wrong choice when they don't fully understand the nuances of rigging and presentations. In this Beyond the Bait video series powered by our friends at Streamlight, I'm going to offer a uniquely technical focus on the best baits for bass fishing. Along the way, I'll try to dispel many of the wives' tales, myths, and misnomers associated with bass fishing. Hi, I'm Dr. Todd Kuhn, editor in Game & Fish magazine. Come along as I attempt to help you put more fish in the boat. Now let's get to it. You know, as we've seen, soft plastics come in a wide variety of sizes and shapes. It's hard to imagine anything having more variety than a soft plastic when it comes to fishing. So, as they come in a variety of shapes and sizes, so do hooks. And there's a reason, because you have to match the hook geometry with the size and shape of the soft plastic for the hook to work. A lot of times people will use the wrong hook, not knowingly, but will use the wrong hook for the wrong soft plastic, and they don't catch any fish, or they catch very few fish. And the reason is because they're not matching the hook to the soft plastic. When I talk about hook geometry, what I'm talking about is the gap, the hook gap. It must match the size and shape of the bait. If you have a really thick, wide bait, and you're using a little narrow gap hook, you're never gonna catch a fish if you're fishing a Texas rigged. Because when you bury the hook gap is not wide enough for the hook to pull through the soft plastic and into the fish. Likewise, if you're using a gap that's too wide or a hook that's too long, again, the geometry is incorrect for the soft plastic, you're greatly reducing the bait's ability to be fished in an effective manner. In other words, it doesn't look right to a fish. If the hook's too long on a short bait, you're fishing with a stiff bait, versus a hook that's too short on a big long bait. It may give it a lot of action, but the hook is too short to set and catch the fish. So matching the geometry to the geometry of the bait is critical in catching fish. There's any number of hook geometries out there. There's straight shanks, there's cammed shanks, there's bent shanks, there's curved shanks, there's wide gap, there's narrow gap. There's all kinds of geometries, and while there's a lot of geometries, a lot of that is just personal preference, the kind of style that you like. There's a lot of style hooks out there. There's cammed hooks, there's bent hooks, there's straight shank hooks. There's an enormous amount of different hooks out there, and a lot of that style of hook and what you use is a matter of your personal preference. So don't necessarily get hung up on a brand name or some kind of gimmicky hook that promises that you're going to catch more fish because of a certain geometry of the hook. Try several and use the one that you catch the most fish on. But I'm going to show you how to match the hook to your soft plastic so you catch more fish. To demonstrate the variety in just a swimbait hook, a weighted swimbait hook, I picked out 3. This is a mustad with a grip pin to hold the bait onto the hook shank. It's an unkeeled weight. In other words, it's just weight put onto the hook shank. This is a Berkeley swimbait hook, and you'll notice it's just got a bend in the shank to hold the swimbait on. Nothing special here, but the weight on the shank is keeled, which means it makes the swimbait swim better because it's hydrodynamically shaped. And then you have another Berkeley hook, which is the same hook as the other keeled hook, only it has a screw keeper on it, which means you can screw the swimbait directly onto this, where you're not hooking it onto the hook shank, to keep the bait on, keeled and weighted, and then Texas worm rig this. So that's 3 different hooks, all the same hook essentially, all a swimbait hook, but in 3 different styles. Lots of variety here. Now, individual features of individual hooks can add to their advantages. For instance, we're talking about the Swimbait hook, and this Mustad grip pin Swimbait hook that's weighted has this grip pin like we talked about to hold the bait on the hook. This keeled weight does a couple of things also. It adds weight so you can cast the swim bait. Swim baits are naturally pretty light, and they're not typically very aerodynamic. So when you go to cast one with no weight, it'd be nearly impossible, it would just tumble. So the weight adds weight so it can be cast further. Another thing that does is it adds counterbalance to the swim bait on the bottom, which makes it balance correctly in the water. And when you kill the bait, it has a natural flutter to the bottom, which if it was unweighted, it would do nothing. So there are also advantages within the design and geometry of hooks that you need to look at when you're buying a hook. While hook geometries matter, so does the hook gauge, the wire gauge. Wire gauge of the hook is extremely important because it determines whether or not you're going to be able to set the hook on a fish. And what I mean by that is, these are shaky heads. This is a really small shaky head, very small, with a super, super light gauge hook. In other words, the wire is very, very small. Now, you would want to use this with light line because a small diameter hook takes less energy to set on a fish than, say, a larger diameter hook, a larger gauge hook. So, small wire gauge hook, small line. Large wire gauge hook, larger line. Along that same line, no pun intended, when you're selecting the rod to use with the hook, you want to select a rod that matches the wire gauge of the hook. In other words, on this small shaky head, you wouldn't use a worm rod because when you went to set the hook, you've got too much power in the rod and you're going to flex the hook and you're going to pull it directly out of his mouth. So if I have a small wire gauge hook on the shaky head, I'm going to use light line and I'm going to use maybe a medium action rod. So when you set the hook, there's some give and it doesn't take as much energy to set this small gauge hook into the fish's mouth. On a larger gauge hook, like this shaky head, you would not use this on a spinning rod. You would use this large gauge hook on a, well, you could use it on a spinning rod, but on a medium heavy rod or on a bait casting rod with a heavier action because you're driving a larger gauge hook home than a small gauge hook. Less energy, small hook, more energy, big hook, more energy, big rod, less energy, smaller rod. Now when you're selecting a hook, you know that a light gauge hook uses less energy to set into a fish's mouth than a larger gauge hook. So lighter gauge hook, lighter action rod, lighter line. Bigger hook, bigger gauge hook, bigger rod, more line. I highly recommend that when you're selecting a hook, you pick the smallest gauge hook that you can get away with. And the reason is because it takes less energy to set the hook. If it takes less energy, then you're going to catch more fish on a light gauge hook because you're going to hook more fish than a larger gauge hook because even if you match the rod, you still have to have more energy to set that large gauge hook. So give it a try, experiment, and go down to the lightest gauge hook you can go down to and still hook the fish. Another advantage of a light gauge hook is as the gauge goes down, the size of the hook goes down. You want to stay with the smallest size available or the smallest size that you can get away with because it keeps the bait fluid. And what I mean by that is a soft plastic, its action is determined directly by the hook's length. The longer the hook, the less action a bait has. The shorter the hook, the more action a bait has. So you want to go with the smallest wire gauge you can because that in turn means the hook is smaller. So go with the smallest gauge size of hook that you can to keep the bait fluid and keep it working and giving the best action to get the most strikes. Now today there's a lot of hooks available that are chemically sharpened. In fact, most are chemically sharpened, which is a fancy name for narrowing the point and making it sharper, versus a mechanical means of sharpening a hook, which is a file or a hone. So they come really sharp from the manufacturer. But let me tell you something, after you catch a few fish, they do get dull. They're not impervious to getting dull. So to check the sharpness of a hook, And this is the only way that I know. Most people stick it on their finger and go, it seems like it's pretty sharp. But what I do, and what you might want to try, is put it onto your thumb and drag it very gently across your thumb. If the hook sticks as you're dragging it, and I mean lightly drag it, then it's sharp. If it doesn't stick when you drag it, the hook is dull and it needs to be replaced. So try that. I think you're going to find that a lot of your hooks that you're fishing with aren't exactly as sharp as you think they are. Another important consideration when selecting hook size is your line size. If you're using a light gauge hook, you want to use a very, very light line. And try to use the lightest poundage you can use. Now, bass fishermen have this mindset, bigger is better. That's not necessarily true, because when the fish stop biting, they don't want to see your line, and they become line shy. Likewise, if you've got a large hook and light line, you can't generate enough energy to set the hook. So if you're using a large gauge hook, you want to use a large poundage line. If you're using a light gauge hook, you want to use a low poundage line, because matching your line to the gauge of the hook is going to make you get better hook sets and catch more fish. Here's something that I do with my hooks that I think keeps me a bit more organized, and I think it'll help you also. I label all of my different hooks in the little compartments. I bought a label maker at one of the office supply stores. It's very, very inexpensive. And I just put what the hook is and the size. And that allows me to be able to find which hook I want without having to search around in the box. And keeping your hooks organized like this is a big deal, because when you're in the heat of battle and the fish are biting and you want to find a hook, and if you've got them all in one box or one compartment in the boat and they're just jumbled around and you're looking for that right hook, man, you can miss a lot of fish. So keep your hooks well organized like this. This is one of the Plano, new Plano boxes that they have out, and it does a really, really great job of keeping your hooks organized. So give that a try. I think you can catch more fish if you do that. Hey, thanks for joining us on this episode of Beyond the Baits, powered by Streamlight. I hope some of the information contained in this video will help you become a better bass fisherman. For more information about bass fishing and other outdoor topics, join us at GameandFishMag.com or pick up a copy of Game and Fish on a local newsstand near you.